Second one is division of powers between center and state. So we have seen that prior to 1833 Act, the legislative powers are rested with the, for Bengal province there will be an executive council, and for Madras there is a governor, and for Bombay there is a governor. So these persons are the council for a Bengal province. They will be, so let me write it. Prior to 1833 Act, for Bengal, the legislative powers I am talking about. For Bengal, there is a council, Governor General in council. For Bombay, there is a governor. We have discussed this actually earlier also. For Madras, there is a governor. So it is prior to 1833 Act. Governor General in council will be responsible for bringing up laws and policies for Bengal presidency. Governor of Bombay will be responsible for the same thing, and Governor of Madras will be responsible for the same thing in respect of their respective presidencies. Under the 1833 Act, all the legislative powers were centralized. Okay, so the power was vested with the Governor General of India, and his executive council, So Governor General of India and his executive council will be having authority to bring laws and policies that are applicable to throughout British India. So this was changed under the 1861 Act. Which delegated the legislative powers to the provinces. So by restoring the powers of legislation under the provinces, so it actually restored the situation prior to 1833 Act. Prior to 1833 Act, the legislative powers were rested with the provinces. So the same thing has included under the provisions of 1861 Act, which delegated the legislative powers to the provinces. Got my point here? Right. So here, remember one thing: whatever the legislative powers that were given to given to provinces, there was, yesterday also we have seen that there was no clear separation. There was no clear separation of powers. Sorry, there is no clear separation of subjects, legislative subjects. So under the provisions of 1861 Act, it was said that all the matters which require regional variations, they will be under the control of the provinces. All the matters which require regional variations, they will be under the control of provinces, whereas all the matters which require uniformity of legislation, they will be under the control of the central government, or under the control of Governor General of India and his executive council, or under the control of the Indian Legislative Council, better to say. Okay, so all the matters which require regional variation, they will be held with the provinces, Provincial Legislative Council, right? Similarly, all the matters which require uniformity of legislation, that will be under the control of the Indian Legislative Council, right? So there was no such kind of clear-cut separation of legislative powers between center and the states. So the discretion or the authority to decide whether a matter falls under the category of regional variation or falls under the category of uniformity legislation, that will be decided by the Governor General of India. So he can say something like, even though the matter is regional in character, he can say that it has to be implemented uniformly, so it will be under the purview of Indian Legislative Council. So it is at the discretion of the Governor General of India. He will decide which matter falls under the regional variation or which matter falls under the uniformity of legislation. So there was no clear separation of legislative powers even under the 1861 Act. Although the 1861 Act has granted legislative powers to the provinces, but there was no clear separation of subjects. Got my point? Only under the 1919 Act provisions, there was a clear separation of subjects between the center and the state. Yesterday we have seen that. Only under the provisions of the, from 1861 till 1919, there was no clear separation of legislative powers between the center and the state. Under the provisions of the 1919 Act, there was a bifurcation, or there was a separation of legislative subjects into two. That means legislative subjects were divided into two. One is center list and provincial list. Got my point? Provincial list. So far we have discussed till 1919 Act. So this bifurcation or this separation of legislative powers or this separation of legislative subjects between the center and the provinces were further streamlined further streamlined or further strengthened under the 1935 Act. We have come all the way along period to 1935 till 1919. In what way the legislative powers were divided? The period to 1833, what was the situation? Under 1833, what was the situation? Under 1861, what was the situation? From 1861 to till 1919, there was no clear separation of legislative subjects between the center and the provinces we have seen. Only under the provisions of the 1919 Act, there was a clear separation by creating two lists, central list and the provincial list. So this separation was further strengthened. This what we call separation was further strengthened under the 1935 Act. So under the 1935 Act, legislative subjects were divided into three: federal subjects, provincial subjects, and concurrent subjects. Got my point? Federal subjects, provincial subjects, and concurrent subjects. Right. So by dividing the legislative subjects into three, where the federal subjects are under the control of the Central Legislative Council, provincial subjects are under the provincial list. The subjects which entered into the subjects which enlisted under the provincial list, they are subjected under the they are under the control of the provincial legislators, whereas the subjects which are enlisted under the concurrent list, they are under the control of both central and provincial. This is clear replication of what we are having today under the Schedule 7. Under the Schedule 7, there are three lists: Union list, state list, and concurrent list. In fact, the Indian Constitution has inspired this division of powers, legislative powers between the center and the state from 1935 Act. Got my point? From 1935 Act, the Indian Constitution has inspired this division and it included into the Indian Constitution. So under the provisions of 1935 Act, the legislative subjects were divided into three lists: federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. Under the federal list, all those matters will be included which need uniformity of legislation, and it is under the control of Central Legislative Council. Whereas under the provincial list, all the matters of regional variation will be included, and they are under the control of provincial councils. And matters of common interest between the center and the state will be included under the concurrent list, where the center and the states both having authority to legislate, and the central's authority will prevail over the state's authority in a particular subject under the concurrent list. So the same thing that we are having today, the same thing is reflected. In fact, Indian Constitution actually adopted this division of legislative subjects into Indian Constitution. So this division was inspired from 1935 Act. Right. So the legislative subjects were divided into three under the 1935 Act: federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. So whatever the matter that is not included in any of these lists, if a particular matter is not listed, then that is known as residuary powers. Those are known as residuary powers. Today also we are having residuary powers, right? So legislative subjects under the Act of 1935 are divided into federal list, provincial list. Legislative subjects divided into federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. So if any matter falls out of the purview of the division, in other words, if any of the matter that is not enlisted under any of these lists, if there is a particular matter that is not included in any of these lists, then that is known as residuary powers. All those residuary powers will be under the control of Viceroy. Got my point? Viceroy and Governor General of India. Keep this in mind, okay? So, okay, let me take it for 2 minutes. So in the context of Indian Constitution, this is irrelevant here, just for some kind of, right. So under the context of Indian Constitution has adopted this framework from 1935 Act. From 1935 Act, Indian Constitution has adopted this framework. That means the legislative subjects are divided into federal, right, provincial, and concurrent. The same thing is replicated under the Indian Constitution also. But whatever the residuary powers which were given to the Viceroy and Governor General of India, so here, the Indian Constitution did not adopt the same thing. did not adopt the same thing, but it changed it in a way. So under the Indian Constitution, the residuary powers are granted to the central government. So the residuary powers are granted to the center, whereas here the residuary powers were granted to Viceroy and Governor General of India. So whatever the residuary powers which were granted to center, this provision was inspired from Canadian Constitution. Got my point? Canadian Constitution. So we will be looking at it in our unit named as Sources and Salient Features of Indian Constitution. Sources and Salient Features of Indian Constitution, where we are going to delve into all these topics. But for the time being, because we are at this point of topic, so I have included this. So Indian Constitution has inspired the division of legislative subjects into federal, provincial, concurrent. So the same thing has been replicated under Indian Constitution also. So Indian Constitution has inspired the division of legislative powers from the 1935 Act, but the names were changed. In place of federal, union was used. In place of provincial, states was used. So in place of concurrent, the same thing, concurrent. Okay. But whatever the residuary powers which are given to the Viceroy and Governor General of India, the Indian Constitution has granted those powers to the central government. Parliament.